Dun, dun, dun.
Did we lose Kevin? Oh, there he is.
We did. That's not good. All right. It says even though through that glitch, looks like we're live. So let's get the intro on.
We are live. Welcome everybody back.
Walk the Talk America presents Guns and Mental Health.
Let's just make it
a
clunky.
podcast for firearms owners, clinicians.
It's not a
curious
WTTA
public.
podcast unless it's clunky. And now you cut the intro music off. Cut right to the chase.
It got mad. Rob left his seat and it gave me a big flashing error. And it said, you need to refresh your screen. And here we are. The clunkiest
All right.
intro we've ever had.
Everybody, welcome back to the WTTA podcast. I'm here with Kevin Berry, the co-host today, producer. What's happening, Kevin?
It's not going so hot right away, but I think our luck's going to turn around.
Yeah, we'll glove save it. And then a man who absolutely does not need any introduction, provocative figure, controversial figure, WTTA family. Welcome back to the show, Rob. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good to be here. Proud to be part of a glove save. Any sporting reference we can get, I'm in on. You know that.
I know you're a big sports ball fan.
That's right. And it is basketball season. So
There you go. How have you been, man? How are things?
good. Busy. Here at Avidity headquarters, just boxing up some stuff, getting ready to send out some goodies to some FFLs around the country. And just got back from a trip to Denver. Before that, I was teaching up in Michigan, getting ready to go teach out in Hawaii again. And summer is here down in North Carolina. So got a lot going on.
Yeah, you wear so many different hats, whether it's PDN, Avidity, Walk the Talk America, all the stuff you do on your own. It's crazy that, all the teaching, and it's crazy that you, I always complain about like the 25th hour. I need that 25th hour of the day. And I don't know how you have the energy to do what you do.
I think that really part of it is that I'm doing something different, from sometimes hour to hour and certainly week to week and at least day to day. And that is what keeps me going, I think. Right. So if it were just doing the Avidity arm stuff, then it would be like, you know what, I'm going to take a day off. But I get a day off from Avidity Arms when I'm teaching on the range. I get days off teaching on the range when I'm sitting in a policy conference. I get days off from all that when I'm doing, a Zoom or some kind of media thing. So that's really what makes it possible to keep going, I think.
Yeah, well, one of the things I wanted to talk with you about today. So I don't think I'm speaking out of school, but I've always thought that you were one of the most misunderstood figures in the firearms industry, right? One of the things that I think is amazing about you is the stuff that people never see, because you do a lot of, no, it's true though. Like you do a lot of behind the scenes work. I've seen you do it with me and you do it by yourself. Right. The biggest fear I think a lot of gun people have is going into what they call enemy territory, or places where we're not necessarily welcome, and having really hard discussions. But I think you really thrive there. Right. Having you at the research conference, and I've said this on air before, it was one of my favorite things is to watch you run around that conference and just basically checks and balances for people that might have an opinion on something or throw out a statistic and things like that. And I think, that's really, you definitely thrive in those situations. So I feel like we're very similar. Like we like to ask a lot of questions. We challenge views, but we also, don't necessarily like offend people when we do it, especially when we're in those scenarios. So we've been having a lot of discussions about two things lately. Obviously, one being a statistic that's being thrown around all the time now. It seems like everywhere that firearms are the number one killer in the youth, right? And we can break down whatever that statistic is, how that how people get to that number. Usually it's like a 1 to 17 or 1 to 19 years. And then the second thing that we've been talking a lot recently about is ERPOs, but you've been working on this project that's kind of going on behind the scenes, and it's not just anti-gun people, but it's a combination of a bunch of different gun people. I know David Yamani has been part of this, and other people that are Walk the Talk America adjacent, I would say, to us. I don't know how you want to talk about this stuff, but we've been doing so much talking by text and we get on calls, but I really want an update from you to tell me like where you think some of this stuff is going and dissecting some of these statistics that get thrown out. And obviously red flag laws is a hot button. So why don't you just jump in and tell us what you've been up to lately?
Yeah. So this project, some days it's number 1 on the list. Some days it's number 8 on the list of projects going on. But back in maybe November, December, I was reached out to by Tufts University, specifically Dr. Michael Siegel. And if people have been following, what I would say is if you're following at a detail level, what the gun control side says over the last couple of years, not, there's a difference. And this is where I think we thrive. And I think they think you're right. There's a big difference between getting into a conversation with gun control people and gun control advocates, anti-gunners, whatever you want to call them, and just reacting to what pro-gun groups say the anti-gunners are doing, right? So there's a huge difference there. And there's been a difference for a long time. So if you go back to, me rolling my eyes when the NRA says Obama's going to send the UN in to take all our guns, that's not interesting to me, right? Like what was actually said is interesting to me. And we have to have those conversations, or at least be paying attention. If you've been watching, about 5-7 years ago, something like that, an organization called 97% showed up. When they showed up, they claimed to be like bipartisan, politically agnostic, ideologically agnostic, maybe, with the exception of trying to reduce negative outcomes involving firearms. And there were people on their founders list or their board list, their directors list, who were like diehard. Like there was a past president of Brady. There were some people who clearly were in the gun control camp. There were some people who had worked for the NRA, but left. The one person they really highlighted as a former NRA lobbyist was somebody who I think was after Sandy Hook, like broke ties with the NRA and said, I can't do this anymore. So it was weird that they were trying to say, here's an NRA person, except it was somebody who literally left the NRA space because she didn't think that what they were doing was in the best interest of the country. So it was pretty obviously a gun control setup organization, but they were preaching this idea that like 97% of American gun owners or Americans in general are pro gun control. And they came out with some pretty ideologically neutral stuff at first. And what they were doing a lot was quoting this Dr. Siegel. So that's how I became aware of him. And when they put up his sound bites or his quotes, it was all pretty rational stuff, I mean, and I say rational, like I'm self-editing, right? Because for our audience, even saying the word reasonable is toxic, right? Reasonable gun control or whatever. So, but what he was saying was reasonable, was rational, and he's a researcher. He worked in tobacco law reform and tobacco marketing reform for years, and he's a public health guy, and he's looking at guns as a potential public health problem. He's doing the research, and he's coming to some conclusions. And he says things that make sense, like, it shouldn't be about getting this type of gun out of everybody's hands. It should be about finding the people who shouldn't have any guns and figuring out how to keep the guns out of their hands while not burdening the responsible gun owners, which something I say, might be something you would say. A lot of our friends say things like that. So, but because he's wearing a 97% hat, he's like the enemy. And yet he's rational. I've never had a conversation with him until last fall, but he reached out and he said, hey, Rob, putting this thing together. He dropped some names of people who are going to be involved from the pro-gun side. And he said, I'd love to have your input. We've never worked together, but I'm familiar with what you do. Of course, I told him I was familiar with what he does. And I knew that it looked like he had backed way off from what 97% was doing, because about 2 years ago, 97% just flipped the switch and became very overtly gun control and pro-gun restrictions. So it looked like he had backed off from a lot of that. So I did a couple Google searches and saw kind of what he was up to lately. His big thing was actual violent acts are the only reliable indicator. And of course, that makes them the best reliable indicator of potential future violent acts. So if you have someone who's done some violent stuff, then maybe that's the person that should be on our radar and our list for not having guns. He also said some things along the way about recidivism and timeframes on recidivism and percentages on recidivism, and the idea that, just like if you are a felon in this country federally, you lose your gun rights forever, right? And only very recently, under Trump's administration and the new Department of Justice and the new Attorney General, have we started to see the restoration of rights. Even though technically there's always been a way to do that, it's never been funded and it's never been mandated. Now we're starting to see that process kick in. But he was ahead of the curve on this, saying it, a couple years ago. So I thought, all right, if these are the kinds of things he's saying, and of course I'd heard a bunch of other good quotes from him before, why not? Because ultimately, even if it was just, hey, Rob, we have an army of gun controllers that want to write a bunch of policy for the state level. Would you like to come in and talk to them? I'm still going to say yes, because as I've always said, I think we need to be in the room. It's like, sometimes when the gun community is mad at me on the internet or something because I'm talking to the enemy or whatever, collaborating, it's like, I kind of want to do the Jack Nicholson, right? Like, you want me in that room. You need me in that room, like and this goes all, the NRA has done this. Second Amendment Foundation has done this. There's always been, recently, in fact, the NRA was just bragging on how like they were responsible for making sure they were in the room during the 94 assault weapons ban to make sure there was a 10-year sunset. And the new director of the Institute for Legislative Action was bragging on that during the NRA's recent convention. And it was almost like, oh, does he remember that he's not supposed to say that? Because the previous regime under Wayne LaPierre would never have admitted that they would so much as go into those conversations. But it is important that we're there. So I thought, what a great opportunity to help influence this project, which was interestingly aimed specifically at policy proposals for red states. So in other words, it wasn't about another law in California or Massachusetts. It was about what can we do in states that don't have maybe any state level restrictions, or work towards reducing negative outcomes is certainly the way we would want to characterize it. And he promised me that inside of this policy proposal, there would be wins for gun owners. And that's really what if there was ever a hesitation, that's what got me in the room, because I was super excited to find out what are the wins that the gun controllers are okay with, let alone maybe even proposing. Maybe they're seeing something I'm not seeing, because I don't even know what those could be in a state like Tennessee or a state like Georgia, or Texas. What are these wins you're speaking of? Tell me more.
I completely agree with you. Right?
Yeah, I was taking a breath. I mean, I just want to make sure. I'm letting you cook. I'm letting you cook. Checking in. I didn't know we lost Kevin. Kevin's not always on the podcast with me, so he doesn't know what's gonna. He didn't know you pulled the string and I was gonna go.
No. I'm good with you going. It's fascinating to me, and I agree with you. I agree with you that we need to be in those rooms and we need to see what they're proposing, and we need to be there for checks and balances and speed bumps and making them think about the things that they don't think about, right? I mean, we've already shown that there's so many unintentional consequences that most people have never really walked through. And then usually when they do, that's when they pull you aside at these conventions. They're like, I never thought about that. That's really interesting. I'm going to bring this up later, right? So
let's like starting there, right? Which even if let's say I disagree with everything in this policy package, right? Now, this was supposed to have ended last weekend, right? So this is the draft of the policy package that basically they want to be able to walk into a state legislator. I'll just keep using Tennessee as the example and say, here, this is what we think would reduce negative outcomes of firearms in your state without unfairly burdening gun owners. And we think it could pass and get signed by even a Republican governor because it's got some baked in wins for your gun community and for your constituents who are responsible gun owners. So that's where that starts. But even just ideologically, couple of highlights. We did extend the project for 3 months, so it looks like we'll be ending closer to the fall than we anticipated, just because there's some really good things that came up at this 3-day meeting we just had in Denver. Concerns from both sides. And to reach closer to consensus, because there are 6 parts of the proposal. Walk the Talk America will be happy to know that there was 100% consensus on the suicide prevention proposal. We had another like 95% consensus. There was another one that was around 90%, another one that's in the low 80s. And then we've got 2 sections of the proposal that we didn't get to. And that's the major reason that we're going to extend for another couple of months and work. And when I say consensus, here's a couple interesting facts. One, the room was crafted to be ideologically even. However, as we have run into, there are a lot of people who are, I'm a gun owner, I'm pro gun rights, but,
But
and
always a
those
but.
people in this, in this room, those people who had like actively worked for gun control organizations and actively campaigned for gun control laws that had no wins whatsoever for gun owners in various states were definitely counted on the pro gun side. So when I look at the room, we started with just over 30 people. We had some quit, which I'll get to here soon too. I probably saw like 6 that I would say are definitely like the kind of people who are going to the NRA convention, going to SHOT Show, going to different other gun industry events during the year, and are definitely affiliated with gun rights organizations pretty wholeheartedly. A couple of like local NRA type instructors who would categorize themselves as pro gun, I'm sure, and no disrespect to them, they're just not at the level of even my level of ideological purity, which we know gets called into question sometimes just because I walk into those rooms, right? And then there was a lot of people who were on the other side. And interestingly, of the people who have quit the project, there are a few that I don't know why they quit. There are a few that I absolutely know that the reason they quit is because they did not feel like the gun control community should be care about what Rob Pincus thinks. Now it's interesting. I wonder, like, how did they get in the room? One of these women, I went to her webpage after she quit, after like the 2nd or 3rd month, and on her social media, it was like she was ranting against the project openly. Like, I don't know why we think we need to work with gun owners. Gun owners have proven that they're irresponsible and they don't care, and we as a community need to be fighting against them, not with them, trying to work with them. And I promise you, this was one of the most professional, cordial, well-run Zoom distance projects that I've been involved in. I've been involved in a lot of them. It's being facilitated by a group that this is what they do. They bring people together from opposite sides on complicated, nuanced issues, and they have a great structure, great process. I was very skeptical at first that their process was going to work, but through strict time limits and a lot of structure around when you can ask a question or when you can express a concern or when you can just raise your hand and say, I want to contribute something not related to what's already been said. That structure has made this an incredibly productive and efficient process. But some people just didn't like it because, I got equal time with a person who was talking about, saving just one more kid. And I was talking about protecting Second Amendment rights. And there were people that were invited into the room that didn't feel like I had any place at the table, and they quit. So it's interesting that the pro gun side has sort of gained pieces of the, gained percentage of the room just through attrition, because I don't think anybody on our side, certainly not the most diehard people in the pro gun rights, they've stayed in the room. And one of whom has been pretty much like against anything that we've said, but his voice is in the room, and it's important that he's contributing. And I almost don't think there's a counterpart on the other side where I can say anybody who's left on the gun control side has been vehemently no compromise. So it's really, but that's been interesting. Individual examples. We did have a live fire range day in Denver. We all got on a bus from the conference center and went out to an indoor range where they had set up a array of guns to use. I actually brought a few of my own guns because I knew like I wanted to bring a suppressed 22 AR. I knew I wanted to have some braced pistols because there was concerns about short-barreled rifles, because we're advocating that states get rid of redundant laws against suppressors, short-barreled rifles, AOW, full auto. Just when the federal law changes, as looks like might happen very soon with suppressors, we want states to be able to just fall in and let responsible gun owners get access to those things without having to have another legislative session. States like Georgia have restrictions against suppressors on the books, even though it's generally a permissive state. So even some of the states we're targeting, we want to get rid of that. So I wanted to give people the opportunity so that I could say the next day in the meeting room, like, well, now you've seen the difference. You shot a regular AR and you shot a short barreled one. What do you see that there's no functional, practical, meaningful difference, except in the ways we want to use them as responsible gun owners? It's not going to affect, a school shooting or a suicide or anything like that. So that was powerful. There's been one person, I don't want to be too specific, but there has been one person who's been very much in the media outside of the room from the gun control side. He's been involved in some national newsworthy events, and they have not gone his way. And he made a statement in the media just a couple days before our meeting in Denver. And I went to the guy who's facilitating this, because I have to have like my nice guy hat on, right? Like follow the rules. And I told him, I said, look, I can't in good faith go in to talk about industry regulations, which was a section that he and I were definitely the loudest voices in the room going back and forth on. I said, I can't go into a good faith conversation with him with this quote that's out in the media from him without bringing it up. And rather than bring it up in a room with, 20 something people on the panel, the Tufts University staff and your facilitator staff, and make it a thing, I'd rather just pull him aside. That's how I would do it. Just have a face-to-face conversation, because there's certainly things that can get said in the media, or maybe even like one quote out of a paragraph, one sentence out of a paragraph quoted, that maybe face-to-face he's not going to be as like strident, or maybe he's even going to say, well, I just had to say that for the media, I don't really mean it. And then we can have a discussion about that. Or maybe he's going to say, well, that's how I really feel. I'm trying to get along here, but this is how I feel. And I just wanted to have some clarity on that. I thought it was important to the integrity of the process. And the guy agreed. He said, "You want me to mediate it?" I go, I don't need a mediator. But if you're around and you see us chatting, you want to come over and check in on us, that's fine. I don't think anybody's going to be throwing punches or anything, right?
Right.
So I did pull him aside, and I said, when you say the industry, that's me. And we've had a cordial relationship. We've been working together. We found some compromise. We found some common ground, quote unquote, over the last 5-6 months. So I need to understand what you meant to say, what you did say. Was it out of context? But if he started off right away with, "Oh, I'm not talking about you, Rob." And I'm like, well, okay, one way or the other. Right. You're insulting me because you think my gun company that manufactures guns and sells guns into distributors and puts guns out in retailers and doesn't know who the end users are, and can't really practically track who the end users are, and has accepted that there might be some negative outcomes. But we do everything we can to prevent it in any practical, reasonable way, while still putting this product out into the market because we think it's a net positive, not a net negative. Maybe I'll never be as big as Beretta, but maybe. So you can insult me that way, or you can take the way I was insulted the first time. But I really want to dig down on this. And he ended up, after the superficial rebuttal, he paused, and I could tell he was really processing this. And he apologized. Not only did he apologize, he kept to me later that day and said, "Hey, I really appreciate you pulling me aside and making me think about that. I don't know anybody in the gun industry, honestly, except for people that might be, opposing me on a CNN debate or opposing me in a courtroom or something like that. And I've never had to think about it." And then as we closed the session, he made the comment, in the future, one of the things that's come out of this is that I'm going to have to think, what would Rob think about this? And he mentioned one other person in the room. What would Rob think about this? What would that guy think about this? Before I speak, whether it's to the media or even maybe to some of the people I work with on the gun control side, is we need to remember that this is not a monolithic group that we just treat as a they. And I thought that was powerful. Had a woman in another session, which is maybe related to what we're going to talk about with this kids thing. She broke down. She started getting teary-eyed. She talked about this 5-year-old, the family of a 5-year-old that had died, and how she had to hold the parents, in her arms and try to make sense of it and try to figure out how to deal with it. So that's what was in the background of a lot of the stuff she was saying, hadn't been shared. And she knew that was an isolated incident, but it was a powerful incident, and both in her sharing that to give us some perspective on their side, but also to say she recognized that emotion is part of the conversation. And it maybe the conversation can be had better filtering some of that emotion out. So there were a lot of moments like that. There were a lot of really positive evolutionary moments just because I and others from the gun side were in the room. And I would say probably, I've been doing this for a long time. Right. So I've been in that room a lot and paying attention to this for a long time. And I'm sort of cynical and have heard a lot of those stories. But I really do think there were some people who are newer to the game who were coming in, maybe just, what part of the Second Amendment do you not understand? realizing that they had to tone that way back if they were going to have a real conversation. So I think there was evolution on both sides, which was good.
Yeah, that's always like to me, you know how me and you talk about there's these things that people do and they're just like little things that they do. Like, so for example, like somebody who may be a little anti-gun or for gun control goes, I'm an NRA certified instructor, as if, or I served in the military, as if like now all bets are off. Like you have to listen to me. I'm the
Anything you say
resident.
is okay.
Right. And we do it too, right? Like there's certain things that we have on our side that we do it too. I'm not saying that, but one of the things that I do not, it's just kind of, nobody is saying that holding a dying 5-year-old child in any capacity is acceptable, right? In society. Like, but it's kind of crazy because when people like throw that out on the internet, I always say like, oh, have you ever held a dying child from a car accident, or have you ever held from a drunk driver, right? Like, do you have that same energy? Do you get up and you get so angry at alcohol that you say like, I want all alcohol gone and something needs to be done about this? And it's like weird how we accept certain types of death and we just keep it moving, but we don't blame the tool that may have caused that death. And I'm going to say that alcohol in this case is a tool, but it's crazy that the gun kind of brings this passion and emotion out of people. And I've had many instances where I was sitting with somebody that was, you know, revisiting in their head children dying, whether it's Uvalde or, you know, Parkland, and they tear up and they're crying. And it's like, you know, I totally understand it. I validate like that is a horrible thing, but that's not how you make decisions in this country, off of emotional reactions to things that you don't like or understand completely. And I feel like a lot of that happens.
It does, and there's so much of it, right? And it's understandable. I think to a certain degree. I think it's relatively easy when you talk. Alcohol would be, you know, in the category of drugs. I think a lot of people put a bunch of weight on, well, drugs are illegal, so let's get rid of them, and alcohol isn't illegal, so let's accept that. And you know, we talked about. I think well, that's one of the things I've certainly evolved on, right? Like I was all like, yeah, Nancy Reagan, you're awesome. No, 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 and then somewhere, but when I moved out to Colorado, living in Telluride, you start to get a different perspective. Working for Sheriff Bill Masters out there and seeing his perspective as a libertarian sheriff and on cannabis, and then retroactively looking back across my experience in law enforcement and my experiences in life, alcohol does a. I mean, you can't even do the math on how much more damage alcohol does compared to cannabis, and yet, if you'd have asked me in 1999, you know, 2000 as a cop, like heyday of my law enforcement career, I would have, I was like total, I was like Nancy Reagan disciple, just say no. Like you had seeds in your ashtray or in your floor mat. I was in your car. Right. And alcohol was just, you know, so be it. Alcohol is part of the game. So I've evolved my thinking on that. Other people, I think, evolve on guns. I think cars is probably the most obvious one where we just say, you know what, we need cars. Cars are so good. Cars do much show, you know, productivity, efficiency. Like we're not getting rid of cars. People compare cars and guns, and they're like, well, why do we need guns? And there's this utopian vision, I guess, where we don't need guns, but that's not an argument when we're talking about a civil right, and nobody really wants to hear that. And that's hard.
Back to the alcohol, though. Technically, we don't need alcohol.
Right. No, that's what I'm saying. I think people can accept that alcohol is a vice. And then there's this legality issue between, you know, fentanyl, let's say on one side, and beer on the other. They're all vices.
But if you get in a car while you're drinking beer, now you're doing 100%. Something illegal.
No, and I think if you look at the damage, long-term health damage, relationship damage, emotional damage, and then the trauma, the actual car accidents and stumbling through a plate glass window and every other trauma thing that happens under the influence of alcohol is probably doing way more damage than fentanyl. But we're all talking about fentanyl because that's the one that's easy to demonize, right? And there's not obviously a multi-billion-dollar industry that's a million times larger, probably literally, than the firearms industry. We've got the car industry out there and the alcohol industry out there that are lobbying way harder than the NRA ever dreamed of lobbying, or NSSF or NASGW for the gun industry. So those aren't going anywhere, and so we just accept those things. I think when it comes to guns. And again, just from talking to the people and working with the people on the other side of the equation, there's a lot of people that just don't understand any they don't accept any justification for why we need guns. And when I started out, Saturday morning, when we started the big work, Friday night was kind of the social gathering, and we started the real work Saturday. First time we were all in person, because it's 2-hour Zooms multiple times a month for the last 6 months. Where I started out was, we have to accept some things, right? And there's some things on that side of the room we don't want to accept. Obviously, they had us mingled; they didn't really have us like shirts and skins. But that the people that are on that side of this topic ideologically have to accept the reality of the Second Amendment and the civil right, and the 400 plus million guns that we know about in the hands of 100 million owners in 50% of the households in the US. Like, we just have to accept that. And that side of the room might have to accept that. On our side, we have to accept that there are deaths, that there are negative outcomes, that there are recklessly negligent and irresponsible people who have guns, and that there are things that we can do to avoid the meeting of those two realities, and certainly lower those numbers. And if we can accept those things and not argue about how small the number is of deaths, or argue about why we need a gun at all, then we're going to make some progress this weekend. But if we get mired down in either of those extremes, this is all a waste of time.
So that number, firearms are the number one killer in youth, like children. How did that come up all the time during this?
It came up a few times. There was at least one practicing pediatrician in the room. There are other medical doctors in the room, some in the emergency room services. There are definitely activists who are focused on that issue of kids, and of course it's in the news all the time too. So we see it a lot, and whatever the spin, we definitely, infants get taken out, because of all the unfortunate deaths that happen for a whole bunch of different medical and medical practice related and
I don't like
birth
that,
defect
though.
related reasons.
I don't
What's
like
that?
it. I don't like
No,
that
I
they
know.
do
No,
that.
I get it.
I
I understand why they're going to say, well, here's I mean, it gets, I was married to a NICU nurse, right? So there is a question of like, that baby died, but that baby also was born with two stomachs outside of its torso. So what was the viability? So I can see where, from a medical standpoint, they're going to say cause of death in 50 years ago, let alone 500 years ago, that baby wasn't ever alive, wasn't making it, right? So there is some science issue of a lot of deaths before the age of 1 that were inevitable, let's say. So there wasn't a cause of death other than way beyond anybody's control or influence. And we're not just talking about, the quote unquote crack babies, although that piece is a factor too, so that they throw that out, right? So throw out everything under the age of 1. Then you have this problem of, when do you stop being a kid? Is it like, they can stay on insurance now till 26, is it like, till they leave the house? Is it college? Is it 19? For some reason seems to be this number that where 19-year-olds keep getting included, even though I think universally, if we take it without any context and we just say, hey, when does somebody become an adult in our culture? We say 18, right? I think that's the default answer for a whole bunch of obvious reasons: voting, military service, all that, criminal charges. As a society, we accept that you're 18 adult, but yet we're counting 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds in this number to get the number up higher. And I think that's much less fair when you're tugging at heartstrings and you're trying to be emotional. Let's talk about 1 to 17 and 364 days, and we'll count those as kids if we want to say kids. So then you start twisting words like youth instead of kids. Children and teens gets said a lot. So my biggest problem with the number is that it's said as if this all lands at the feet of gun owners and the gun industry and irresponsible parents, because a lot of times what they're talking about when they bring this number up is child access prevention laws. Specifically, you got to store your guns and ammo separately, California style. You can only use our approved safes, and you got to store your guns in this specifically prescribed way, a way which is untenable for anybody that wants to have a firearm staged for defensive use in their home or workplace, right? So all that taken as a whole, you end up having to say to people, which is difficult sometimes in these face-to-face conversations, you can keep saying that it's the number one cause of death for kids and teenagers, or children and teenagers, but the problem is, I'm eventually, if you keep saying it, I'm going to have to start asking you about gang violence, or do I have to call it community violence, or is it group affiliated violence this week? Whatever we're calling it this week, we're going to talk about teenagers shooting teenagers with guns that weren't just left loaded on the kitchen table by the parents.
Right.
Now, we can talk about where those guns came from, and that's a whole separate discussion, but that discussion has nothing to do with them being kids. If we're going to talk about kids, then we're talking about irresponsible parents with toddlers. We're going to talk about kids that were never taught how to operate safely around guns, how guns even work, or this forbidden curiosity, the forbidden fruit thing is created because it's nothing but guns bad, guns bad, guns bad. And yet they look around and they see the same numbers I do, 400 million plus guns in the hands of 100 million Americans. And we know that most of those Americans have to be adults. So that's like half the adults in America, or well over a third of the adults in America. So guns are very common. And this is where the education piece comes in. And this is one of the things I've never been able to put any logic to. Everything else that the educational community considers dangerous to kids, drugs, sex, pollution, fire, swimming pools, like scissors, right? Like we teach kids how to hold scissors and tell them not to run with them because they're going to use scissors and scissors are dangerous. But when guns are dangerous, they'll tell you that all day long, but they won't allow for the education in the responsible use of firearms. And yeah, sure, at 3 years old, it starts with don't touch. But eventually we got to be more articulate than that. Abstinence is not what's going to keep kids away from the sex or the drugs or the swimming pool. We're not going to tell kids don't swim, it's dangerous. So we have to have a better attitude about that. And that's what was maybe one of the more frustrating things that occurred over this experience with Tufts University, is the people that really want to protect kids, but then were like incredibly antagonistic to the idea of mandatory education about the safe and responsible interaction with firearms in the schools.
Yeah, Kevin and I go back. The crazy part about this, the statistic, right? And Kevin is right. Kevin's always like, they are right by the numbers they're using, right? So it's like, that's one of those things. It's not like we could be like, you're a liar. You're just manipulating a number to jack up a number, make it higher, but they're right. But Kevin and I go back and forth about this because there's so much. I mean, Kevin, go ahead.
It just seems like the root of the problem is if you ask 10 people on the street, what's the number one killer in children, they're going to rattle off that statistic of, oh, it's firearms. But then you ask them, all right, out of all those deaths, what were the two most common ways they happened? I doubt 9. Many people are going to know. It's just almost like we throw out the statistic, but we're not saying, okay, here's how those are happening and here's how we can reduce them, like you say, through education or all that. And we know the media clearly doesn't really put much of an emphasis on showing how and why these events are happening. So it almost seems like an opportunity for the firearm industry to say, all right, here's how those breaking down, and here's how we're working to reduce those. So this statistic can't just be thrown in our face every day. Is that kind of your perception too, Rob, of people know the statistic but don't really know the underlying numbers?
Yeah, I think that's important, right? Because if you're talking about child access prevention laws and storage laws, then we got to go to that number, which is a number I love to talk about, because the number of accidental deaths involving firearms, whether it's adult or children, has gone down, depending on what study you look at, over the last 30 or 40 years. It's gone down in one study 80-something% over 40 years, and another in just about every other study, it's at least 50% since the 80s. That's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And especially when you put that up against the ownership and use numbers. So if you look at the numbers of guns owned by civilians in this country, and when I say use, the number one reason people say they have guns is for defense. So when you look at the number of people that can legally carry a gun, so it's not a gun that's just going to be put in a closet or in a safe, but they're actually using this gun every day, or it's sitting somewhere in their home or workplace where they believe they can get access to it to defend themselves, or they're carrying it around. That number has gone from like 2 million people who could legally do that in the late 80s. There were 13 states, including Texas and Alaska, where there was no legal provision for concealed carry. Now we've got over 80 million people. 29 states have permitless carry. Every state has some version of may issue since Bruin, shall issue since Bruin. May issue has basically gone away. So we've got this incredible change in firearms ubiquity in our country. And yet the number of accidental negligent deaths has gone down by at least 50% in our generation. So when you see that, we should be celebrating it. And the problem is, we do have this habit in the gun community. We don't want to talk about any of the negatives. The one negative we've gotten comfortable talking about is suicide. And obviously WTTA spends a lot of time working in that space. Is we've gotten comfortable talking about this number of suicides and trying to reduce it, and how important it is to reduce it, because it is, give or take, 50% of the firearms involved deaths every year. It's important to keep saying that because that's what's going to keep people focused on proactive mental health care. It's going to help people focus on responsible storage and staging and understanding things like simple things like cause a pause. And it's going to put that number when it comes out at the end of it, or, a couple of years after the stats are all consolidated and we find out there were 37,000 deaths or 41,000 deaths or 38,000 deaths. When you cut that in half, it's still a number that's big that we should do something about. But when you think about half of that being suicides, that other number, when we go back to comparing it to all the guns and all the owners and all the households, it really is small. We're doing a good job. And to your point, Kevin, I do agree. If we took that number of deaths, if we take 18 and 19-year-olds out, we talk about kids, we leave the infants out, and we go from 1 to 18, and we take suicides out of that, guess what happens? That number drops, I think it's by about 40%. If you take violence, child on child, like intentional violence out, even you take the 18 and 19 years out, you still have this youth involved violence that's going on. And then you take out your justified homicides, law enforcement or otherwise, take that small piece out, you end up with a much, much smaller number than people are thinking. You end up with this number like 2,000 to 3,000. 2,000 to 3,000, is that too many? Absolutely. But as we dig into it and we figure out how many of those are preventable by something like a child access prevention law. And the fact is that there really aren't that many that are impacted or would be even on paper impacted by a law that is not only incredibly unenforceable, like trying to figure out what people are doing in their private homes, a law that a lot of gun owners rebel against just because it's there, and at least the rhetoric online, which might influence an actual gun owner who is on the fence of locking their guns up or not. If they see 500 people in a comment under one of the big gun rights organizations saying they can't tell me what to do, I'm not locking my guns up, well, that rhetoric might increase bad behavior and irresponsible behavior for a home with toddlers in it. And then last piece of the puzzle on that is prosecutors, and this has been well studied and well documented and well reported in the media, prosecutors are incredibly unlikely to use those laws against parents when they've had a tragedy in their home, when they did leave the unloaded gun in a purse or sitting on a table and a child gets it and kills themselves or kills the sibling or something like that. The prosecutors are incredibly unlikely to use the law to prosecute anybody. So you've got a law that just creates this political turmoil, probably has a negative behavioral impact on the targeted community, and rarely gets used.
Yeah, diving into the data, I think, Mike, we spent 5-10 hours talking on this topic. It seems like suicides are also on the rise between that 1 to 17 and 364 days too, to where I could see the other side maybe not understanding it, to saying, oh, preventing access will also reduce suicide, so let's also push legislation there. It's almost like the gun industry needs to not maybe throw out the numbers, but separate them, like you say. Here's the categories.
Yeah, for sure. No, I'm not saying to dismiss it.
One.
Right. Yeah, it's not to dismiss it. It's just to accept the reality that in a lot of households, the 16-year-old has access to the firearm. So educating the parents doesn't start and end with lock your guns up. It has to be, here's why. One of the things I say to parents, we run our family firearm safety seminars, is look, you can have I don't know how many houses I've been in where somebody brings their 4 or 5, 6-year-old over and gets so excited to show Rob, the gun guru guy, how the kid can recite the safety rules or demonstrate where to put their trigger finger on like a water gun or something. Problem is then like 5 minutes later, the kid's out at the pool shooting that water gun at their cousins or their neighbors, right? And it's like, well, that's why I don't think you should be teaching safety rules with a gun that you know they're going to go turn around 5 seconds later and shoot their friends with. Like that's what that gun's for. Laser tag, airsoft, paintball, squirt guns, like the, rubber band guns, whatever it is you're like that's not where you practice safety rules unless in your house you're also never going to let the kid play laser tag or play paintball, right? We have to understand that this is nuanced. And when you say, well, with a 3-year-old, what's nuanced, Rob? How can they tell the difference? Well, then if you're in that camp, don't give them a squirt gun, right? But when you are teaching the safety rules, they have to be applied appropriately, right? I think the problem is we all were teenagers. We know that boundary pushing, complete disregard for potential negative outcomes and long-term planning and thinking goes out the window. Exploration, experimentation, all these things that teenagers are clinically known for are real. So you can have a 7-year-old that's awesome at demonstrating those safety rules, maybe with a real gun, 10-year-old, right? Like my older daughter, when she was 10, she was coming out of the holster at defensive pistol competitions, right? Like she was very well versed in safety and use. But that didn't mean that when she was 16, she didn't do dumb shit. And that some of that dumb shit could have involved a firearm, right? If she had had open access to it. So it's not to say she couldn't shoot or didn't have access to guns or couldn't get into the gun safe with me. But the idea, like when I always say it, like I grew up with absolutely no restrictions, access to guns, had my own little gun safe in the room, could do whatever I wanted with guns. Luckily, no negative outcomes. But that's not how I've raised my kids. And in fact, with my 10-year-old, I'm going to be doing things differently than, you know, as she goes through her teenage years, just because I know more and I've seen more negative outcomes and I'm more guarded and I accept more restriction. I accept more delay in my own access to guns than I would have 20 or 30 years ago. Right? Like I said before, like I've evolved a lot even before walking into the room with the Tufts Project. So I think it's important to take all that into consideration when we start talking about how parents act with kids. You again, you come back to this idea, you're not going to change a parent's mind about locking the guns up if they've watched their kid go from 4 to 10 or 12 obeying the rules and demonstrating good gun safety. You can't just say guns are dangerous, they should be locked up. You have to say teenagers are morons, right? You got to keep an eye on teenagers. And it's about the teenager behavior. It's not about the gun. And if we're not educating the teenagers and we're not educating the parents of teenagers, that's where, yes, access to firearms as a teen can contribute to negative outcomes. But there's underlying issues with the teenager. It's not the gun.
Yeah, it'd almost be nice to wave the magic wand and have the data presented to where it's easily digestible by the very different outcomes of firearm by suicide, unintentional injury or shooting, all the different categories. Because like Tova says, like when you break it out, then the accidental drowning is higher for the preteen numbers when it's broken out that way, instead of just lumping it all in together and just presenting it out to the public. Oh, this is so terrible. And everybody's so kind of emotionally triggered, but not really seeing the why and how can we actually change these numbers.
I just saw a comment comes up. I guess that means we're live.
We are live.
We are.
Oh,
we are live.
That's fun. I thought we were recording. I thought I didn't pay any attention. Fun.
No, that's why the intro of the show is hysterical because
so
we're
bad.
live.
I wondered why we didn't redo the intro. Now I got it.
We had no choice. No, but the thing that kills
audience.
the thing that destroys me about this, and I kind of wish there were more people that were on the gun neutral or gun ignorant and anti-gun side that knew that there were people like us out here that they don't care if that number is the 5th most in children or the 1st. Like we are not going to stop what Walk the Talk America does.
Exactly.
It doesn't.
Exactly.
It doesn't. We're not less inspired. Like, oh, okay, like it's number 4 or whatever. It's behind drowning. We're not going to care. I mean, this is what we do 24/7. And I feel like there's too many people over there that are worried that if they don't inflate a number, because me and you have a mutual friend right now that we're working with, that he's so caught up in the attention grabbing of this thing, and we're like, it's kind of become an anti-gun rally cry Like, let's
Yep.
just not do that. Right. Like, you're saying different things. Like, let's celebrate the wins. Let's be positive for once and keep going. But I do understand why that side feels like, hey, like, we need to make sure tension's drawn to this because no one's going. But it is a little disingenuous in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't agree. I think that is such a horribly flawed approach. You know, the NRA has done a lot of fundraising around shit like Obama's going to bring in the UN, so send us your money and we'll fight him off. Just, you know, ludicrous things, right? Or the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, right? Despite, you know, over 60% of active shooters being stopped by unarmed good guys that take action, right? And in people's faces when it happens at the Super Bowl parade, you know, on television and gets replayed 100 times, people tackling a gunman, and like the next day, this is why you need to carry a gun. Well, needs the wrong word, my friend. Maybe it's why you should think about carrying a gun. Maybe it's, hey, it would have been better if those people had guns. Maybe they're lucky they didn't get hurt, but at least they did something. But we can't deny the facts, right? And then, you know, same thing on the other side. You can't deny facts and reality. When we hear them say things like, you know, assault weapon ban, and we know that it's just a made up political term, and 97% of the people calling for assault weapon bans couldn't come into this room and touch all the guns that are assault weapons without just touching everything that looked like, you know, that one up over my head. That'd be the best they could do, right? And so if you, and then some of those would inevitably be guns that were not whatever their technical definition would be. And it sort of reveals, I guess this is another thing that came up. It's sort of, I was gonna say, it sort of reveals the I'm just anti-gun. Like, I don't care what that gun is, the fewer guns the better. One of the other things that came up in this process, and I have a scheduled call to help someone understand why I'm so adamant about it, is this idea that someone kind of called for, on the basis, I think, of like respectfulness in the room. You know, I keep hearing people say gun control, and many years ago, gun control organizations realized that that's just a pejorative term, and we really want to stay away from that. And the term gun safety organization is a much better one. And my thing is like, bullshit. When you're, what, you know, do you consider the NRA a gun safety organization? Well, no, of course not. Okay, well, they have tens of thousands of instructors out there in the world teaching gun safety. That's what they do. It's like a primary thing that we can get behind with the NRA is they certify instructors, and those instructors go out and teach people how to be safe when responsible and use their firearms properly. So when your organization starts doing that, because when your organization says it's a gun safety organization, but ultimately you put out zero information about how to be safe. You don't promote safe ownership of guns. You promote the idea that guns are dangerous. So if you want to be safe, get rid of them. So no, I will never respect that request for those to be referred to as gun safety organizations. I'll continue to call them what they are, which is gun control organizations. Now, if I want to be insulting or if I want to go to an extreme, I'll call you an anti-gun organization, right? And I honestly do think there has been an evolution on that gun control side where there's been a lot of acceptance over the idea that, okay, we're not going to have this utopian get rid of all the guns. We're not going to go the way of England or even the way of Australia. That's not happening in the US. So they've given up on that. And that's why I don't call most of these organizations anti-gun. And I don't call most of those people anti-gun, but they're absolutely pro-gun control, and they're absolutely gun control organizations.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and that's fair. I mean, I tell people all the time, I'm like, the difference between Walk the Talk America and say like Brady is Brady has a butt, right? But if Brady's talking about responsible storage, we're very much, it almost sounds like we're talking from the, you know, the same corner, because they talk about lock boxes, they talk about quick access safes. I mean, I've seen it. I know JJ, right? But there's a huge difference between Walk Talk America and Brady in the end. You know, ours is, hey,
yeah, I think one of the big pushbacks against like the education in schools, even though to me, again, we talk about why it makes all the obvious sense. One of the big pushbacks is, well, that could encourage gun ownership. It's like, well, why do you care? If someone is following all these procedures and rules that you want in place, would you care? And that causes a big silence. And that silence is people looking into their souls, as far as I'm concerned, because they realize that is a big question. And I think for most of the people in the room on the gun control side, the answer is no. Like they definitely want fewer guns. Like it's not okay if somebody just follows all the best practices and follows all the rules, that they would not say, if I'll say things, sometimes I'll up the ante because I'll get like a superficial, well, that'd be fine. Okay. So you're cool with every single person in the US having guns in their house that isn't mentally defective, isn't violent criminal, isn't, hooked on drugs or whatever, like just all the quote unquote, like non-prohibited people, you're fine with them all having guns, and you would encourage it as long as they did well. I would encourage it, right? So I'll test the waters with that. But to me, that's a really big question: is are you okay with more guns and more gun owners and more households with guns as long as they're responsible, or do you just keep falling back to, well, no, really, I'd rather there weren't guns, and I'm having to swallow that so that we can get these rules in place. Okay, well, then just be glad I'm calling you gun control and not anti-gun.
Right. So what other type of reactions? I mean, I've seen you do it. Like when we were on the convergence team, like I've seen you talk about the education for children and how we need to get to the youth. And I think we both back programs. I mean, Walk Talk America's always looking at programs when it comes to youth shooting sports and the ways that you can educate kids and get them involved. But like, are you hearing anything else did anyone like, I think you said one time
it's a lot of hemming and hawing, it's emotionally, it's hard. There's, in the current proposal as it reads, and again, we've got room left for some evolution one way or the other, but I think there's at least two different places where it talks about bias. And it was funny. There was, and the idea is that in any curriculum that there shouldn't be any political bias or position on the appropriateness of gun ownership one way or another. And it was funny to watch in the room as we were going line by line, wherever it was the first place, it said political bias. And there was a lot of pushback, like, well, people have their politics and, different communities feel different ways about this. And I don't know if we should be limiting people's politics in this curriculum development. And then later it said something about not taking a position one way or the other on gun ownership. And that the same side of the room that was maybe more worried about bias earlier was all of a sudden like, well, that's perfect. I'm glad it says that. And it's like, they're the same thing. Right. But somehow you read political bias as different from bias against gun ownership, but that's exactly the bias we were talking about in the first place. So we're still hashing through that one. That one has not been settled. It's one of the more contentious ones. And again, there are some people who I think are just 100% against the idea of talking about guns at all, because somehow, like, as if every movie and every television show and every comic book and every TikTok thread and whatever there's kids are going to see guns. So there's this one very naive Victorian idea, like kind of, and I'm sure it's the same on the sex education side. If we were having that conversation, there's people like, we don't want to talk about sex in school, like as if kids aren't going to bump into the concept of sexual intercourse at any point outside of that classroom discussion. So I think that's naive and that's utopian in their way. We just don't want to talk about it. Then you got another group of people who might want it talked about, but all they want to say is guns are dangerous. Here's the numbers. They just want to pull the black lung out of the bag and say smoking is bad. Don't do it. Just say no, run away. They don't want it, but to me, that's disingenuous, because a 13-year-old is going to sit in the room and be like, but my uncle has a gun. Maybe my parents might have guns. The police officers all have their guns at home, the security guys, right? So there's this trap skeet clay pigeon range next to my house. I drive by, the bus drives by every day. So I know there's guns out there. So let's not pretend that it's just instant death. If
right.
There's a gun
all
in
the
house,
good guys
right?
in every movie are drawing a gun
right,
to beat the bad guys.
So I think that's disingenuous. Then you have this other group that's like, yeah, I get it. But man, it's dicey, because what if people bring their politics into the classroom or whatever? What if one kid gets inspired to go out and try something with a gun because of that class? And there could be negative ramifications we're not seeing, and then it goes to the side of more the pro-gun side, where it's like, absolutely, we need a class, but that class has to have age, or now the correct term is developmentally appropriate levels of discussion. So we want to make sure it's like, don't touch the gun at 5, and we don't start talking about responsible uses of guns until 10, and maybe into the teenage years, talk about what responsible storage should look like. And I'm thinking, in my world, I'm like, think about the impact that like our generation have. Kevin, I think you're a little younger than Mike and I, but like think about our generation's impact on seatbelt use or smoking on our parents, right? And all that came from schools and PSAs and driving it into us that smoking was bad and seatbelts were going to save lives. And our generation put a lot of pressure. I know for me, it was more of the smoking thing on my parents and uncles and aunts and grandparents. For my brother, he was more impacted with the seatbelt use. Well, it became a thing that was really important. So I think we can educate kids about what responsible ownership should look like, so that they can go back into the families and be like, hey, Dad, how come you aren't locking the gun up? Or, Dad, is that gun up on the wall operational, or is it functional? Is it non-functional now? Which is something we do in our house, is we might remove a key component. So there's still some guns that you can see, but they can't be used. And the guns that can be used, you're either not seeing them, or they have a quick access, like a stop box lock on an AR, or they're inside of a quick access safe. So, and then you've got the other side, then you got the other extreme, which I think is unreasonable and just a little naive on our side, which is all kids should be taught how to shoot. Like we're not going to get the public schools to take all the kids to the gun range. So, there's a spectrum, and that's what, go back to the beginning of this conversation. I think that's what's the most important thing inside of our community. We need to remember, we need to respect, is that there's an ideological spectrum that even gun owners are going to be, maybe not all the way to the end, but they're going to be 2/3 of the way from pounding on the table, everybody should have machine guns issued to them, when they turn 18, all the way up to the people should be able to buy guns, but we all should have to get training, mental health checks, a note from our doctor, and our neighbors need to have notification that we brought a gun into their house. There are those gun owners too. And then on the other side, you've got people who are, nobody should ever have a gun, all the way up to, yeah, I'm okay with you not you having guns until you prove that you can't be responsible. Then you should never have guns again.
Rob, is there a source right now if a community came and had the education board on and you said, hey, check this group out. They educate kids on firearms at different age groups that's appropriate for them, and no edits. Does that resource exist, or has it been not created yet?
It doesn't. It's unfortunate that really doesn't exist. There are some states that have integrated some ideas. Of course, the NRA will say we've got the Eddie Eagle curriculum, but the Eddie Eagle curriculum really is aimed more at younger kids and don't touch. The 4-H programs around the country do a really good job of teaching responsible use at developmentally appropriate stages. We have inside of IC Training Company, we have the Family Firearm Safety Seminar. I've actually talked about working with 2 different gun rights organizations in fleshing that out and making that more of a national program. What it has come up repeatedly in these discussions is, well, where is this curriculum going to come from? And that's where, again, kind of where do you land on the political spectrum? Some people are like, well, what we should do with the state policy, if we're going to legislators and telling them what to do, what we need to tell them to do is they need to direct the Board of Education to put a program in place. And then they'll follow that up with, people who trust the Board of Education are also going to say, and it's going to take them 2 to 5 years to figure it out. And I'm like, well, all we did there was just kick the can down the road and create another, bureaucracy element. So I'm more like 6 months task force, educators, child psychologists, firearms use educators, and teachers at various grade levels, and put them all in a room, tell them they got 6 months to figure it out and come up with a product, and then direct the Board of Education to implement it. Because I think if you don't put a time limit on it, this is something that just gets lost. Now, maybe that'll be my 9th project sometime later this year when this thing's over. Maybe I'll sit down with a couple guys and try to come up with something that would look like a curriculum. I think the problem is what I get to teach in the private sector, and what an organization like USCCA or Guns for Everyone National might put out as a program in the private sector would not be cookie cutter. You couldn't airdrop it into a public education system because of all the considerations that we need professional educators and child psychologists and all that in the room to give their stamp of approval and give, their expertise in terms of the number of hours and the appropriate language and all that stuff to fit into that public education space. So I would love to see something like what we're talking about in this project, where a state is tasked, where the legislators and the governor signs it and they say, okay, this has to be done. You got 6 months to figure it out. And I think that would create a starting point, at least. Then we would have something to look at, and it could get nitpicked from either side and from the educators. And let's get it into the field and test it, because right now we got kids dying, and some of those deaths are preventable simply through education.
Yeah. So, and I completely agree with that. And I think, that I guess that's why, like, I didn't have a problem necessarily with the number of kids dying. And then underneath, like in the project that we're working on, right? We're working on a project with Rob Borg on basically how to put locks on guns and keep guns safe.
Yeah, how to lock them up, right?
Yeah. And when I was trying to steer him away from using this statistic and throwing it out, I was like, you know what? The compromise for me was put that number up there. Like, this is the number of children that die annually. And then I was like, underneath it, put something like, many of these could have been prevented. And I think, Kevin, you gave me the idea. Many of these could have been prevented by using this sheet or by visiting this page, right? So it's like, you have a number that's like big, you see it, it's a real number. I mean, these are kids dying, whether or not we agree on the age range, but then kind of drilling down to, well, we're going to talk about a specific few in here now that we got your attention.
And that's the way I look at it, right? I mean, that's why my thought was celebrate the 50% reduction in accidental and negligent deaths over the last 30 years. And then whatever that number is, like if it's 2,000 kids died in 2023, whatever the last year we have the data on, in ways that could have been preventable by simply controlling unauthorized access. Are you doing your part, or what about the guns in your home? And I think when you take the entire gun, because again, if you're going to emotionally respond to this, it's the number one cause of death. I think all the gun owners have seen that by now. We've all been confronted by it, and we've heard it rhetorically refuted and the statistics dismissed, and we've all talked about how they're twisted. I just don't think it's impactful. It's impactful for fundraising. Like, if this guy is trying to put out a flyer that's going to get fundraising to a gun control organization, that's a great one, right? But if you want to go to a gun show and set up a table and have people not just, give you the finger and leave their trash under your table, but actually stop and talk and maybe pick up a lock or hit the QR code, then I think I think the behavioral aspect with the gun community is you want to say, look, just about everybody's doing this. And as a community, we've done a great job getting this number really small. If you're not helping, you're part of the problem. So get on board. And here's a simple way to do it. I think that's going to be more impactful with our culture, with our society. And we are the target population. You're not trying to convince somebody who's anti-gun, who doesn't let a gun in their home, to have cable locks and know how to use them.
Okay. Well, I want to switch gears a little bit here. Let's talk about the ERPO. How's that going in these conversations? I was going
to suggest we do another podcast next week. So
we could, Rob, we could do that.
Maybe we should. Do that. I think here's the thing with ERPOs. There's let me kick this back to you for a second, because we have talked about this a lot over many, many years, red flag laws and ERPOs with Walk Talk America. Without, you haven't been in this project, do you think there is a product that we could come up with, a proposal that we could come up with and say, here's the 6 pages on ERPOs that we would propose for a state like Tennessee or Georgia? And again, if the consensus is there's 25 people in the room and 22 of them say this is good enough, and 3 of them have a dissenting opinion, and maybe we explain why, but our name's on the project. So everybody's putting their name on the project. Do you see a potential for a product coming out of that room that Walk Talk America could say, this makes sense, and get behind and promote?
Are you talking about alternatives, options to ERPOs and red flag laws, of like, don't do this? No,
it would be an ERPO proposal, but it would not be. I mean, obviously, it's not the law that's currently in Connecticut
Okay.
or the law that's currently in California. But like we would come out with something that would be called an emergency protective restraining order or an emergency. Now I can't even think straight. A red flag law. We come out with an ERPO or red flag law, an emergency provision for taking away someone's firearms and access to firearms that would meet muster with the gun community, or even what I would consider a very forward-thinking organization like WTTA.
So I'm not about to get myself drummed out of the gun. Kevin, you want to take this one? No, I'm kidding.
I got it.
All right, listen.
Well,
listen.
This is my point. Let me let you off the hook because this.
No.
Point.
Let me say one thing.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me say one
I was
thing.
gonna let you off the hook, but go ahead.
No. Don't let me off the hook because for starters, I would have to see the person removed along with the firearms. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah.
If
you the person go leave society for a minute, take a time.
Yes. If you're bad enough to where you can't have your firearms in your person, I don't think you're in good shape to have knives. I don't think you're in good shape to have a car. Right. Like I don't want it. So it would have to be, we had to get them out of there because it was bad. I mean, you see what I'm saying? So that would have to be a starter. And I don't know if people would agree with that. But if you're not good enough to have your firearms, you're not good enough for me to be out on the street.
Kevin, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I like where Mike took it. I thought initially of like just titling it the same as every other law. It'd be nice to shift it away to call it something else to start leading the new alternative to everything that's already existing. Just because everybody's gonna, like the statistic we're talking about, everybody says that statistic, negative reaction. It'd be nice to introduce a new concept and build something new and say, here it is, kind of like what Mike's talking about. Hey, if you're a danger to yourself and society and you can't have firearms, then maybe, yeah, you're taken away from society for a little bit or something like that. And then add in other innovative ways we've looked to promote responsible storage, make rebates, and put in the legislation that maybe gets childhood education, some commitment for investing in that, all these different things that we really think can reduce negative outcomes from firearms, and have that be the plan instead of adding red flag law. But this is red flag law 2.0. Don't worry about all the other ones. It's not that.
Right. And I think that's part of it, right? So when I first started having these conversations inside this project, it was sort of like we're starting in the wrong place with this terminology, right? If we can't say an evolve, we can say evolved ERPO, we can say firearms rights respecting red flag law, like whatever you're going to do. Those terms are so burned right now, right, that it's very, very hard to see anybody on the pro gun side being open to having the conversation. So why? So then the question is, okay, why? Well, due process gets thrown out a lot. I do roll my eyes a little bit because, when someone's driving down the road and they get pulled over for, the lights come on, we're starting due process and we've already taken away the person's freedom. And then we can put cuffs on them, right? We can have the conversation. We can charge them with DUI long before the conviction. They've got to serve 24 hours in jail in some states. I mean, there's all kinds of situations where we take property, we take freedom without a court hearing. And I think that unfortunately, a lot of people have a very sophomoric, position on their education around due process. And they think that when they say due process, they mean there has to be a court hearing before you can do anything negative to a person. And that's just not real. That's not how it works. So due process is something that gets talked about. We have to talk about what it means. We need to make sure that there is a punishment, an articulated punishment for malicious use. So if whether it's law enforcement or otherwise, and we saw that put into the law, 4 or 5 years ago now in Colorado, and we have seen convictions around the country, including at least one in Colorado, a conviction of someone who used red flag law maliciously and was convicted of it. We have to, one of my personal things I've said for years is, to your point, Mike, if this person is in such a bad shape that we've got to deprive them of a civil right, then they need mental health care. And so a mandatory mental health evaluation is something that is a starting point that gets us over the edge of, like, gets us to a conversation. But if there's not going to be at least a mandatory mental health evaluation, then you've lost me altogether. We've got a
Tovis is just
series
asking a
of
good
things.
question on that, Rob, of
Do
would
those
the
make a
involuntary
person-
mental health care, if they had to forced to receive mental health care, would that then prohibit them from owning firearms going forward?
Yes, and maybe is the, because it would kind of depend on what the mental health care was, right? Like if you get treated for depression, maybe in some states, maybe not in other states. There are other things you might get treated for anxiety. No, probably not at all. You get treated for other diseases, so mental health is so big, right? We got to remember that, like, mental health is like physical health. There's so many different things going on. So if and let me say at this point, there's a huge difference. And I don't know if he was asking a question about what Mike was saying or what I was saying just then, because Mike was talking about take the person off the streets if they're that bad off. What I'm talking about is mandatory mental health evaluation. So an evaluation certainly isn't going to get you put on a prohibited person list. In some states, involuntary commitments could get you put on a prohibited list. How that's reported federally to NICS is also a gray area. There's HIPAA issues, there's all these things. We know that the kid that shot up the grocery store in Buffalo, New York, a few years ago, he was involuntarily committed. He was evaluated and he was released. The person released him and said, nah, he's fine. And so there was an involuntary commitment. It was in the state of New York, and yet the person was not put on a prohibited list. And I still want to know that person's name. I want to know that what's the status of that person's license. I want to know have they been held accountable for their role that they played in that process. When all the steps that we would ask for is, if the person's a problem, get them evaluated. If the person won't get evaluated voluntarily and you really think he's a danger, involuntarily commit him. And let's really find out what mental health professionals think. Well, that happened in that case. And yet, whatever it was, within 18 months, he had bought a gun and shot up a grocery store. So the none of this is guaranteed, right? But for me, the mental health evaluation is a starting point, free of charge, right?
I don't think that that evaluation, though, because the nuance in the conversation is what, like you said, mental health is a big, wide spectrum, right? So
right.
Someone having depression that may need to be away from their firearm because it could be a threat to themselves or others at that moment might not be that in 6 months, might not be that in 6 days, right? Even a 5150, which for those of you who don't know what that is, it's not just the name of the Van Halen album, but a 5150 is a 72-hour hold in California. And I've had someone that I cared about and loved very deeply get put on one of those holds. But the minute she started acting normal, they couldn't keep her anymore.
Right.
So someone had to make
kid in New York too. He was only in for like like 1 day.
Right.
Thing.
So someone had to make the call on my ex at one point. She's okay now. We can't hold her here. So I don't know what she wasn't. I knew she wasn't. Right. Like in the perfect world, and I didn't want her to stay where she was. I didn't want her to stay captive, but I was kind of like, can we hold her long enough to keep her off the streets, to keep her running back to drugs? But that's just not how the world works, right? They explained to me, they're like, no, once you snap out of it and you're acting normal, we have to let you go.
So some of this comes back to freedom isn't safe, right? And very few people in the room, even on our side, want to say that, right? And that's something I'm pretty quick to say, like, freedom isn't safe. We have if we don't accept that reality, then we're always going to be chasing the one death is too many ideal, right? And we're not going to get to one death is too many on any of these categories: drowning, cars, alcohol, drugs, sex, guns. We're not stairs. Like, we're not going to get there, right? So bicycles, whatever it is, big dogs, like, we're not going to get to one death is too many on any of these topics. So we have to accept that there's going to be cracks. People are going to fall through those cracks, and we have to allow sometimes openings, not cracks, not holes, not loopholes, but openings for freedom. And in that free space is danger. So how far do we go in restricting someone's rights without that mental health evaluation. So you look at it's like an emergency restraining order. That would do it. But what a emergency restraining order requires a specific threat, a specific target, and a specific complainant to come in and say, I feel threatened, or here's the problem. You certainly can have law enforcement involved, but there has to be a target, right? And that's what a lot of people say. Well, if there's no target, there's no restraining order opening. When it comes to involuntary commitments, there'll be a lot of police officers that show up in the room who advocate for gun control who will say, oh, well, that's easy. I mean, if I'm doing an involuntary commitment, all I have to do is just get the guy to the hospital and then I wipe my hands of it and walk away. And in my personal experience from law enforcement, that's bullshit. It is, yes, there is a longer tail to a criminal charge, but when you serve an ERPO, you also could be, and I'm done. There's a lot of weight that comes with taking somebody to the hospital, especially because the hospitals are underfunded and they don't want you bringing a whole bunch of people in your police car to the mental health institution, especially because it dissuades people from seeking mental health proactively if they think mental health is only a ramification of interaction with the police in a lot of communities, including the gun community. So I don't buy into this idea that it's a cop out for the cops. It's easier for the cops to take them to the hospital than it is for them to do a red flag or an ERPO. I think in some jurisdictions that may be true, in some agencies that may be true, but certainly not all of them. So the alternatives, which is another big piece of the discussion for the gun controllers, there are actual legitimate alternatives. And one of them is, because a lot of the examples are like, well, what if some guy's running around in the street saying he's going to kill his neighbor if he, drives by again and makes too much noise and he's disturbing him watching TV. That guy's not quite there and he's making that threat. Oh, what was that word you just used? Threat? Yeah, we have criminal laws for that. There are charges that can be filed. There's protective orders that can be issued, and they do restrict, in all cases, they restrict access to firearms. And it specifically is a response to an actual criminal activity, making a threat, intimidating, harassing, all of those things. So, disturbing the peace is a thing. If some guy hasn't made a threat, but he's just out there making a bunch of noise, rambling incoherently and disturbing people, that's a charge. That trespassing is a thing if it's happening in a public space or it's happening on somebody else's private property. There's all kinds of ways that law enforcement can interact without having to run right to the red flag law. At the other extreme is where you are, Mike, which is if this person really represents a danger to themselves or others in the trained but not mental health professional trained opinion of law enforcement, they can always, in every state, there's a provision for the involuntary commitment, different durations, different criteria, different procedures, but there's always a procedure available to them. And usually it's not very convenient for law enforcement to go through, but it's something we need to be doing more of, I think, in these cases. If somebody really is that much of a threat that we're going to restrict their civil rights, especially considering the lag time, right? If I go have an interaction with you as law enforcement, part of the due process is now I've got to go to the court or go to a magistrate, get this order, and then I have 24 hours to come back and serve it. Well, if this person was such a danger, why am I not getting them off the streets now? Why am I not addressing it right now? Either because they've committed a crime or because I can take them to the hospital through the mechanism of that 5150 or whatever it is in different states, Baker Act, things like that. It's the tool that should be used much more often, honestly, in these cases. And that's what I've been advocating for, is more of that. Now, because the concern is, as you know, in Nevada, we're all one tragic event in any state, including Georgia, including Tennessee, North Carolina. You are one traumatic event from gun laws coming in. Even Florida had gun laws come in under Pam Bondi, right? Under we had age restrictions and other things come in Florida. Nevada went hardcore against certain types of guns just 4 or 5 years ago. So there's a complacency, I think, that sets in where people would say to me, Rob, I understand when you say you have to be in the room or we want you in the room if there's a chance to make the law in Massachusetts not as bad. But why would you ever want to even talk about gun laws in Tennessee? Well, because we're, it's CMA Music Fest in Nashville. God forbid something crazy happens at Country Music Fest in Nashville this weekend. You're going to have every country music singer, every politician in Nashville, and that's the seat of power in Tennessee, calling for gun control. So we are one event away from gun laws, even in those states. So I think it's important that we're talking about what an ERPO, if it's going to exist, should look like. I think it's important that we're talking about these other things. Let me end this, if we can wrap it up a little bit, with some of the wins, because I think that's an important part of the conversation. It was going into this for me, and I think people maybe still haven't heard well, Rob, what are the wins? What are we getting out of this? One thing we're advocating for as part of this package is a protection for the private right to manufacture firearms, except as controlled by everything's going to be except as in the federal level, right? Because these are all state level proposals. So explicitly codifying a protection for private gun making is important, because ghost guns, quote unquote, are so demonized right now and under attack. Tax incentives for training, tax incentives for safe storage and safety locking devices. And that includes the idea that, like in Tennessee, where there's no state income tax, or Nevada, where there's no state income tax, you can't have a tax deduction then in state law, but you can have sales tax exempt. So in Tennessee, I think sales tax is almost 9% now. So a 9% discount on your training, including your training expenses inside the state, and safes, quick access locks, things like that. Incentives, tax incentives for manufacturers. Anybody who's making safety devices, which is broadly defined. So it could be a safe manufacturer, a lock manufacturer. I think under some explanations, anybody who was talking about developing safety, enhancing safety in a firearm. So like, look at what SIG did, right? Where SIG has kind of evolved the drop safe criteria, right? Because of their problems they had early on with the 320. Now people are doing much more extensive drop testing. Most manufacturers are. I would see even that as falling under the umbrella of the tax incentive qualification. We've got a proposal that all redundant federal laws are removed from any state codification, so that if suppressors come off the NFA and are no longer treated like special status by the feds, you don't have to have another round of legislation in the state to get that law affecting anybody. Or if the Supreme Court were to make a generalized ruling, you don't have to have a legislative action or have a law hanging over people's heads that just kind of gets in the way. That also opens us up, if we have a real ruling. Some states have tried to like take suppressors and short-barreled rifles out from federal restrictions by saying, well, if it's made in the state and it's sold in the state and it stays in the state, then the government doesn't have the interstate commerce clause to reach in and get involved. The Supreme Court has not yet said that's okay. But if they ever do, then again, getting these laws off of the state rolls would be important. We also have a lot of talk around nonviolent felons, getting nonviolent felons removed from the prohibited list. Now, again, at your state level, that may not mean anything until it changes or gets changing faster at the federal level. And the other thing we have built into every level of the prohibitors list, so whether it's violence, mental health, violent felony, obviously things like that, whatever reason you're put on a prohibited list, in our proposals, all of those have a window. So if it's something like attempted murder, it maxes out at 10 years. Most of the restrictions we have end at 3 years, because the real data about recidivism says that, if somebody's going to commit another crime, even if it's like a violent crime, but not something like attempted murder, but an assault, an aggravated assault, those assaults, if somebody's going to do it again, they almost always do it within 3 years. And you see this kind of like 90% of recidivism happens within a year, 85% happens within 2 years, 78% happens within 3 years, then it drops off. And all of a sudden you're at like, there's hardly any increase or decrease. It just kind of planes out with recidivism after 3 years. So with that data in hand, it's okay. So your prohibition to own a gun should end after 3 years. If from serving your time, your penalties, whatever your fines, your jail time, your probation, when you're rehabilitated, and to your point earlier, Mike, when you're allowed back into society, you're allowed back into society with your civil rights restored, not with this gun prohibition hanging over your head. I'm sure I left some things out, but it's there are definitely some wins in there. I think it's incredibly important to focus on that as a reason we need to be doing this work, as well as obviously tempering what the gun controllers might try to get pushed through, and even in these red states could get pushed through in the aftermath of a tragic event.
I know we're ending up, but what's your percent kind of confidence that groups that come together with all these different perspectives can come up with some kind of thing that looks good for gun owners? Because like you say, all the different perspectives matter. Just in that kind of thought exercise, you have a mental health examination. Well, what happens to that individual that does the mental health examination? What happens if they mess up? Do they have any liability? Like, there's so many things that need all those different perspectives from them involved. Are you feeling good about something that's going to come out of it, or is it just kind of a deadlock in those conversations?
No, I don't think it's a deadlock at all. I think, like, for example, we have a provision for cultural competency as a requirement for the being picked for the provider of the free mental health exam. Because it's a civil action, you can't have a government provided attorney because ERPOs and red flag laws are not, they're civil actions, not criminal. So you can't have a lawyer provided at government expense. But what you can do is, and what we're including in this provision, this actually came from an anti-gun or pro-gun control lawyer, raised his hand and said, well, you know what you could do is you could have a list of lawyers who would be willing to give their services pro bono and provide that to someone. When you give them the WTTA card about, gun owner friendly mental health resources, you could also give them this list of lawyers who've said that they will help free of charge with people who are served with ERPOs. So there's stuff like that happening, right? There's some good faith stuff happening. I think that you have to, first of all, you're never going to get that 10% that says, all gun laws are unconstitutional. That's all I'm going to say. That's all I'm ever going to say. And I won't give an inch. And I want kindergartners to have machine guns. Like, those people, no, they're never going to buy in, right? But I don't think that's most gun owners. I think most gun owners are willing to say, yeah, the guy who literally stabbed 3 people last week probably needs a timeout on gun ownership, right? Whether he's going to jail or not, there's probably a period of time where he needs to prove that he's not going to commit more violent acts before we trust him with guns. So with somebody like that, that's really where the conversation is. What do we do with that guy? I think that's a real conversation, because right now what we say is you never get guns no matter what. You may go to jail for 5 years. You may get a college degree. You may come out and be a youth violence mentor. You may become a pastor. You may be the best person in your community. And now you're being targeted by some of those gang members who think that you're taking away their street soldiers, and yet you can't get a gun to defend yourself, right? And those are real conversations that happen, and that's real movement, I think, from the other side to our point of view. I think that in addition, you have to put some amount of faith that the areas we're not in charge of, the areas we're not working on, have to work the way they're intended to. So if you don't trust the justice system, well, then who cares what the laws are? If you don't trust the mental health practitioners, well, then who cares what the mandate for mental health evaluation or mental health treatment is? If you don't trust the school system and the teachers, then who cares what the mandate is for the proposal for in-school education? Like, you have to be able to say, we're working on gun stuff. We're going to stay in our lane. And then we're going to give this task to these people over here. And if we find out that what we crafted as this beautiful proposal that had consensus and could really save lives and not oppress responsible gun owners goes over here and they screw it up, well, then let's hold them accountable for screwing it up. Let's not move forward out of fear that we can't control the courts, mental health practitioners, grammar school education, or anything else, if that makes sense.
I think it does.
Yeah, I mean, it's the only way to stay sane, because if you start worrying about, you put provisions in there for people who abuse the law or for malicious use or whatever. You put constraints on there. You put provisions in for training and cultural competency and all that stuff. That's really all we can do from our end. We can't reinvent the educational system. We can't reinvent, the way mental health leans left. That's just not going to work.
Yeah. All right. Well, time constraints, I get it. We want to have you back on soon. I think we could do a whole podcast on the ERPO piece, and I think we should.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's get back together in the next couple of weeks for sure. And I want to thank Sydney Lou. I know you're parenting, and she's been a good.
She's learning a lot over here about firearms policy and mental health.
Exactly. No, but I want you to get back to having fun with her, and I appreciate you coming on. This actually went a lot longer than I thought, but see, I think these are I think these are fascinating conversations that provoke a lot of thought.
And they're important. And what I'm going to do is, the next time we get together, I may ask some of the my colleagues on the other side of the fence to consider coming on and having a chit chat. In fact,
I would love that.
One of the guys who's involved in providing training. He's affiliated with a gun control organization. He provides training to law enforcement in how to use ERPOs, but also how to be respectful in them. And I know he considers himself pro-gun, and he's, seems like a decent guy in general. Been working with him on this project now for a few months. He actually said specifically that he's very interested in what Walk the Talk America is doing, and in trying to find ways to integrate WTTA's ideas into even the training he's providing to law enforcement officers. So I think there's some people that you'd be fascinated talking to, and the audience would maybe appreciate hearing from. We're not going to agree on everything. That's okay. I think that's important to, again, it's a starting point. We're not going to agree. Now let's have a conversation.
Yeah, I love it. So let's plan on that. I think we owe it to the audience real quick. How are you tending your mental health these days, man? Building a house?
Yeah, still working on the house. I got Cindy Lou's over here. She's with me for the summer, and that's the best mental health I've got, is the fun we have. So like she actually went out to Denver with me, and she had friends come out and hang out at the pool. And at the end of the day, somewhere between the work session and the dinner session, jumping in the lazy river with her, or even just going out and shopping and hanging out. We're looking forward to a good summer and hanging out. That's definitely number one on my mental health stability list right now, is quality time with Cindy.
Awesome. That's great. So let's plan on getting you back in on the next couple of weeks. Why don't you talk to whoever you need to talk to? Because I'd love to have that. And want to thank the sponsors. I want to thank the WTTA team, but most of all, I'd like to thank everybody who's tuned in and listened to this, or if you're catching it on a replay. We really appreciate your support. So make sure you smash all like buttons. You share this around as much as you can. And until next time, everybody, we wish you better mental wellness.
Thanks.